10 years, is Allison here? Okay, 10 years ago, Reverend Carlton Pearson had a conversion experience. He wasn't Pentecostal and realized the truth of universal salvation. He started preaching the gospel of inclusion. And his 5,000–6,000 member church went from 5,000–6,000 members to a couple hundred. It was ostracized, he was cast out. The All Souls Unitarian Church in Tulsa reached out to him. He began attending. The remnant of his congregation then became members at Tulsa. That's what he's written. Since then, Tulsa has kind of revamped its worship service, so it has both a more traditional service and a praise service. They have a lively music program. So this is all that, boom, all of a sudden you integrated a couple of hundred African Americans into what was largely a Euro-American congregation. It's a great experiment, and it's in process, and I don't know how it's going to turn out. But I am going down there in the fall. It's an opportunity. I mean, if we can make that work, if we can figure, because he's got fascinating stories. I mean, I've heard stories, so the Pentecostal tradition, folks start talking in tongues. And in the beginning, the story was told, he says that if someone started and then Bishop Pearson went up and said, they're not ready yet. and then Marlon told me that then some of his members, there's some resistance, it's not, but some of his members started quietly coming out to him as having Pentecostal backgrounds and talking in tongues, but only in their cars. So it's a great experiment, it's an opportunity, but it's very much in process, and it would be unfair to me to comment on it. I mean, I look, if they come up with a model that works of worship. They had, who was it at Silmar with me? Who was it? Okay, who was it at Silmar? Tell about the music program. They had their music directors. It hopped. We sang. We sang and sang and sang and sang and sang. And our evening worship service was music, so we sang. And then they'd go into this quiet, meditative music. It was all music. And he would talk to us like this. And he would take us into deep places in our soul, just with his words, as he played music in the background. And we have some silence, and then we'd rise up in the music again. It's very visceral. It's very different than what we're used to in terms of our worship services, but it's very immediate. It's very emotionally immediate. And God knows there's no lack of intellectual content going on the rest of the time, but there was some way of differentiating our need to intellectualize and think about things and our other needs, that we're whole people, and we tend to go on around like we somehow got cut off at the neck, and that we didn't need to address the rest of our emotional and physical needs. And I had not been to a ministry meeting with a tone like that. It was really quite different. Yes, Ted.
Can you sketch out? Would you sketch out just one or two of the things that our congregations perhaps ought to think about to successfully and effectively settle a minister of color?
I mean, the first thing would be to do the, what's the curriculum? Beyond category of thinking. God, I should know that. If you go to search, you have to do beyond categorical thinking. It's that was put in place. I guess we began developing in 1985, 86. Jackie Jane. What?
89.
80. Thank you. Okay, but yeah, thank you, Keith. But we came up with the idea in 86. And it took us that long to develop it. So that's, it takes you through the process of how we do categorical thinking. So if you're calling minister and, well, let's take, we can't have anybody gay or lesbian, and we can't have anybody who's Hispanic, we can't have any black, well, your pool is just shrunk. And you're probably not going to necessarily get the best person. It'll help you to let go of your preconceptions around age, sex, class, all those things, so you actually can find the minister that's suited to you. So the first thing I'd say, if you're going into search, is to do beyond categorical thinking. I would, the other thing I would frankly do is I would do an audit of one's congregation around issues of diversity and what's there, what's not there.
Walk in front of the camera.
Be able to present to the candidates so you actually can tell them the true status of where you're at. I would be looking at your RE curriculum. I'd be looking at typically what you use in worship, what kind of readings you've been using, what kind of hymns you've been singing. I look around the images. I look at your website and see, do you have people of color on your website? I would figure out how to do some sort of audit in terms of your current status, including your history. Like, for instance, Brewster realized that they had captains on slave ships, right? That founded that congregation and endowed that congregation. Well, you need to be completely honest about who you are as you move forward. Get beyond the denial. And part of our denial is just the pretense that we don't have any issues to look at if we don't know. We finally figured out how many ministers of color, Keith. Where's Keith? He disappeared. Oh, there he is. We don't know how many DREs we got, Keith. We're clueless. I've been trying to put a list together for the last 3 months. We don't know. We don't know how many DREs of color we have. And I think it's substantial. But we act as if we don't know it's somehow okay. And though that we can say we want to be this way and not know anything. I can't figure out, we're supposed to be a bunch of intellectuals. I don't get it. Yes. Go ahead, Bruce.
There is a large reservoir of progressive, liberal thinking, NPR listening, ethnically diverse, working class people that we're not touching. And how can we reach those people? How can we change ourselves so that we're welcoming to those people?
Okay, well, let's try this. This is really risky. I did it with my colleagues. I have a strong relationship with them, but I'll do it here anyhow. I want you anyone who was raised poor, working class, lower middle class, stand up. Yeah, right. This is pretty, what is this, 10%, 15% of us, 20%? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Wait, stay up. I want to thank you for hanging in. Classes, it gets thrown at them all the time, and we do it unconsciously, including me. So my response to that is, I have been encouraging, and I did this in El Salvador, that they need to begin to have a conversation. We're inside the box. Okay, we, in this case, I'm talking about me, not black man, me, upper middle class, academic boy. I'm inside that box, and it's real hard for me to see outside of it. But if they begin to have a conversation about what it's like for you who stood to be here, what pieces you've had to give up, what pretenses you had to take on, what you feel when you think about bringing your family in, whether we'd embarrass you or they would embarrass, whichever way it goes. If we begin processing those feelings and begin a conversation, which I can only cheerlead and I can only be an ally with, then we can begin to figure out what it might take. Because I think we'd have to change our whole style. I think we'd have to become more narrative. I think we'd have to drop the big words we use, including me. I think we'd have to have a different kind of music. I think we'd have to think about the message. Because as the upper middle class, we're fairly in control of our lives. And it's quite a different experience, I think, that is my hunch, of being raised poor or working class. You're always kind of on the edge. And there's a whole bunch of theological conversations, but it has to start somewhere, and we haven't had the conversation yet. And the upper middle class hasn't been challenged around our privilege, our unconscious privilege. Just we talk about race, we talk about white privilege, there's class privilege. We haven't had, we're not even close to that conversation, Bruce. We'll fill this place up with upper middle class Hispanics, Indians, and African Americans before we deal with the culture, with the class issue. I will guarantee you that. Vanessa. Last one. Okay, last one. Okay.
It occurs to me that a lot of the things you're talking about, we have to be ready to be in certain ways in the world that are harder for us. Risk-taking, forgiving ourselves, are actually things that we're talking about in Summit around just growth in general. I mean, any issue of change that we have to confront. So it strikes me this is a fabulous opportunity, whichever way we embrace it, to start practicing those things which will only pay dividends everywhere we turn. Because the fact is, if we don't get good at experiment, if we don't get good at risk, if we don't put welcoming the stranger center and everything else peripheral, we will continue the way we're going, which is a slow atrophy to complete insignificance and death.
Amen, sister.
And if you look at the evangelicals that are growing, even some of them now universalist evangelicals, Saddleback, its main worship service of 20,000 people a Sunday, is for the visitor. A Wednesday night service is for deepening. You look at someone like Andy Stanley, who does leadership podcasts that are fabulous, and one of the things he says is, be really clear about what you want to accomplish, and how you do it has to be open for regular review. If it's not serving your ends, you chuck it out. That becomes the way you live. So welcoming the stranger is central, and the stranger isn't feeling welcome and becoming part of you. You let everything else go to find a way to do that. I think we just have to embrace this wholeheartedly, and a whole bunch of our hopes and dreams will probably resolve themselves.
Thank you. I think Vanessa is absolutely clear on that.